Greetings, traveler. Recently, a user called Hugo's Games asked a question about game refunds and specifically why they happen and what's the best way to diagnose them. This is a topic that's always relevant to game developers, and depending on what game you're working on, you might see more or less game refunds. I think they're definitely part of our environment of end of the life cycle of a game. But we always want to know why they happen so we can do better in the future. So in this video, I will go over the main reason why I have observed why game refunds happen and what I think are the two best ways to identify why they happened so we can prevent them in the future. If you don't know who I am, my name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for over 15 years now. And game refunds is some topic that will come into the conversation about a game studio when it becomes important enough. And by this, I mean, if in thousands of sales, there's just a few hundred refunds, then this could be just a statistical expectation, because naturally some people will not be interested in the game, will not be happy with the game. Some people perhaps got it just to review it, and they would return it either way. So I think that zero refunds is pretty unlikely. You will have some of that at some point. But anyway, I think the main reason for all the other refunds, the ones that we as game developers care about, basically come down to just one reason, one topic. And that is because what the players saw in the game was not what they expected. So the game was not as expected based on the material that we released on its Steam page, on the website, on game trailers, and so on. So this has some subcategories. One of them is the appearance, right? And you're probably wondering, how can people misunderstand the appearance of a game, especially when you have visual material of it? Well, sometimes we don't want to show all the parts of the game because perhaps some of them are more tedious, they're not as good looking. Maybe we have a game with lots of menus at some point or some tedious process to do. And we know that for cinematic trailers, you just want high action, lots of explosions, beautiful characters, and all that. So we are encouraged by the state of media, I suppose, to highlight only the most beautiful and appealing moments while not showing at all what the bulk of the game might be made of. So that could be, simple levels or lots of menus or some UI that requires a lot of detail, that has a lot of detail that needs to be worked with, and it's not always about cinematic fights and all that stuff. So if the promotional material shows one thing, but the game itself is 99% something else, then that will naturally surprise some players. Another part is the theme of the game, right? So the gameplay itself, when we're talking about things that were not as expected. So by that I mean, perhaps the cinematic trailer shows a high action kung fu game or something, but the game itself is turn-based, or it's actually a racing game, or I don't know. That would be a pretty crazy mistake to make, but often cinematic trailers don't show what the game is actually like. So players are surprised when they put it on their wish list or they pre-order it, and then when they get to play it, there's too much of a gap between what they thought the game would be like and what it was actually like. And then they immediately think, within a couple of days of purchase, they think, okay, this is not for me, this is not what I had in mind. So of course they would want to give it back. The final subcategory of not as expected games are bugs, right? And of course, everybody expects games to have some bugs. I don't think there's any game with no bugs out there. But we're talking about the particularly critical ones. Namely, the deadly categories are games that, bugs that corrupt the save file of the game. So players feel like they lose all the time they invested in the game. Bugs that have to do with crashes and so on. So again, similar psychological reason. You start playing the game, you start enjoying it, but out of nowhere the game crashes and it doesn't even give you an opportunity to save. Perhaps you saved 10 minutes ago or 15 minutes ago or even 2 minutes ago. If those 2 minutes represent some progress that was hard to make. Perhaps you got a rare loot, or you defeated a hard boss or a monster in these 2 minutes, and now you have to go and do it all back again. That's pretty daunting for players. And finally, just overall performance bugs I found are pretty disheartening to players. And that's not just for people with high-end systems or people who have invested in their gaming setup. It's basically everyone, right? You want to enjoy what you purchased in the expected way. So similar to other games you enjoyed. And most people have enjoyed the biggest games out there, the most polished ones. So that sort of gets set as a benchmark for every game out there. So what this means is you might play a AAA game and think, that was all right. And then you might play a smaller game, and because the performance has some stutters, has very slow loading times, or you don't get the 120 FPS that you expected, you only get 30, then you think this is not enjoyable. It's kind of like watching a movie when you're forced to watch it in black and white, or you're forced to watch it at half speed or something. There's nothing wrong with the movie, but this mode just doesn't bring forth the main interesting part of the game. So that concludes, in my experience, the biggest reasons why someone might want to refund a game. So what can you do about this? Again, in my experience, looking into it directly as possible, for me has worked the best. And I have here looking at analytics for the game and looking at player feedback as two areas that I want to talk about. But let's talk about feedback first, because I think it's the higher quality input at this point. If it is possible to hear directly from the player, then that, in my experience, shows most clearly what the problem was. So if you just see the refund and you don't know the reason for the refund, then it could be any number of things, right? But if you can hear from the player even one sentence, then it might at least place it in one of the categories mentioned before. So is it about the bugs? Was it did it play differently than their expectation, or what was their reaction to it? That, however, is probably the most difficult kind of feedback to get. That's why in my other videos I stress so much the value of playtesting and having an initial community for the game. Because if you just suddenly released the game to the internet, well, the internet typically doesn't have too much time for any given game, especially new games, unless you're one of the biggest players out there. So even on a good case where somebody gets all the way to playing a game, they will fiddle with it for a little bit and make a very fast decision whether they like this or not. This is just what I've observed for most players. So we're in the day and age we live in, we have very little patience and very little time for things that we don't feel match what we want 100%. So that early community, those feedbacks from forums or in-person gameplay sessions, or having that initial cohort where you can talk to them and find out what their feedback is early on, and documenting everything and deciding later if each one of these items is something you want to work on, has the most value in my experience. If that's not possible, then the next best thing is working on some high quality analytics. So what I've seen in my career, basically at every project I was involved in, is analytics is something that marketing does. And here we're talking about larger studios, larger game companies and so on, right? That have multiple departments. So analytics is a thing of marketing and it's a thing of engineering. So they track the bugs, they track the crashes, they track the sales and so on. And most worryingly, they track the sales of in-game items and DLCs and all that stuff. Not that that's not good and all, but to answer today's topic about refunds and why they happen, I think analytics, especially when they're informed by the game design team, can be a fantastic tool. not just for preventing the worst case, like a game refund or just somebody not playing the game at all, but on the other hand, for finding what people enjoy the most in the game and where they spend most of the time in the game. Now, of course, in a game development team, everybody is super busy because there's just too much to do, and we have this natural tendency to want to go for the next peak, like reach the next mountain in development constantly. If the game is good, we want to improve the graphics a little bit more and improve the gameplay a bit more and add a few more abilities and add a few more levels. That's just our human nature, I think. But taking a moment out of that and improving what we already have, I think that's something that's very counterintuitive. At least it was for me for decades in my career. And before even starting game development, I just wanted to create the best thing possible. And that's not a bad motivation, but once there is a critical mass of the game already, once the game has a beginning, middle, and end, then it's time to focus on polishing and complete the polishing process before going further and adding more levels and adding more abilities and all that. So in that process, analytics are super helpful and they're best developed early on. So just like a programmer would write a test for his code saying, look, if everything works correctly with this bit of code I wrote, then the answer should be 5 in the end. That's my expectation. So if I give an input of 3, I expect an output of 5, for example. I believe game design can work in a similar way, although it will be a bit more complex, right? So let's say you have an area, and it's a big area with lots of quests and lots of monsters to hunt and get drops from and so on. If it's an area that you expect players to spend a lot of time on, measuring how much time they spend in that area could be of interest. So if you think that to clear this area, you would need at least 5 hours or something. So if players spend 5 minutes in the area and then they move on to something else, that already tells you something very, very important about the game and how people consider what the game is offering to them in that stage. So I'm a very firm believer of forming your own expectations about how gameplay should be, how players should behave before jumping in and letting players play. And of course, the caveat here is that it's not that if players do something unexpected, it's wrong. Of course, it's not wrong. But to give space to these alternative possibilities, then there needs to be one basic working possibility in the game. So for example, let's say that for the path through a game, so from the beginning to the end of the game, you expect a certain path to complete all the objectives and do all the story submissions and so on. If players don't follow that and they go into a different direction in the game and they go explore the mountains instead of sticking around the village, then something happened there. You designed this beautiful village with lots of NPCs and interactions and little things to explore, but people didn't do that and they went straight for the mountains. That doesn't mean that going to the mountains and having fun there is wrong, but there's 2 key threads here to investigate. Why are mountains so interesting and why was a village not interesting? So from there you could either improve the gameplay around the village, and in my opinion, after that, you can see what was so interesting about the mountains, and is that an opportunity to create interesting gameplay there as well. So this player freedom, of course, we don't try to limit it, we try to understand it and foster it if possible. So there you have it. That's my estimate of why game refunds happen. It's mostly due to delivering to players something that's different from what they expected. And if you can have players directly tell you why they refunded, or hopefully get their opinion on the game much earlier on, way before the refund happens, so in early playtest sessions or having a forum for beta testers during development or alpha development, I think that's a fantastic tool. And finally, analytics, when they're informed by game design or even designed by game design, where you can just, without going into too many variables and tracking absolutely everything, but tracking some basic things. So if you assume, for example, that players should spend maybe 5 hours in the game if they want to complete it, then if you see a playtime of just 2 hours or 1 hour, then you know something is different from the expectation, and it's maybe not necessarily wrong, but it warrants some investigation perhaps. So there you have it. Those are my thoughts on refunds. And perhaps as a final thing, again, don't worry too much about it, because refunds will happen always, and no game can satisfy everyone. So thinking that the ideal of refunds is 0 is probably not realistic in the situation we live in the world we live in. I'd say refunds up to 10%, maybe a bit more, are completely normal, because you don't know the motivation behind everyone's purchase. Maybe they're a reporter and they just want to see the game and get their money back. Or maybe somebody got it as a present and it's not the kind of game they would play. Or perhaps they purchased the game, but it has too high spec for their computer and they didn't know that ahead of time, or they didn't check it ahead of time. So there's all these reasons, and they're not necessarily evil or wrong. We're still people. So even if you see a few refunds, trying to understand them and look into the analytics and the qualitative feedback is probably a good idea, I think. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you have questions about refunds or any other topic of game development, I would be happy to share what I can from my career. Anyway, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, have fun.